Welcome to Sunday Sermons, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of Galatians, chapter 4, verses 1 through 31. And I'll read verses 8 and 9 for us now, as we prepare to hear from our lead pastor, Travis Simone, as he helps us continue in our sermon series titled, Walking the Road Together. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more?
I recently traveled with my family to New York City. Some people might take their picture in front of the Empire State Building or in front of Rockefeller Center. For me, it's the Seinfeld coffee shop. That was my favorite stop on the tour. We had a great trip for just a few days. The one thing was that I needed to take the train home because I needed to work that Wednesday. Nina was going to also leave on Wednesday with the girls, but I was preaching that Sunday and needed the time to prep for the sermon. And so I had the car claim ticket with me at our final breakfast. I also had the baggage claim tickets with me at the hotel. And I said, Nina, don't let me leave without giving you the car and the baggage claim tickets. After breakfast that morning, we walked over to, the kids wanted to see the Plaza Hotel. We walked around. I said, okay, it's my time to go. They were going to do a little more walking down Fifth Avenue and then head to the car. And so I went to the subway station. I was at Columbus Circle. I needed to get to Penn Station. And as I hit the first stop right there at 50th Street, I realized I forgot to give Nina the claim tickets for the car and the luggage. And in that moment, I realized I've got a decision to make. Checking my watch, how much time do I have? I cut it a little close. I wanted to be with the family for as long as possible. Do I have time to take the subway back up to Columbus Circle, then back down to Penn Station to get there in time to catch the train, to do the work for the sermon, which I think you all would have wanted me to have done? But my wife, she's more important. You got to prioritize the family. What do I do in that moment? As the train pulled into 50th Street Station and the doors open, I had to decide, do I turn back or do I keep going forward? As we come to Galatians chapter 4 this morning, the Apostle Paul sees the Galatian church in a similar position, with a similar decision to make, to turn back or to move forward. See, Paul shared the revelation of Jesus Christ he had received after journeying to the very spot of God's self-revelation to Israel at Mount Sinai. There, God revealed to Paul that Jesus Christ was the gospel. Jesus Christ was the good news God's people had been longing for since their time of exile to Assyria and Babylon. Paul reports in the first verses of the book that in Jesus Christ is forgiveness of sin, deliverance from the present evil age, and resurrection to new life. In chapter 2, Paul teaches the Galatians about the proper order of operations when it comes to salvation. Believe, be saved, be transformed. They did believe. They were saved. And then just as the Spirit was going about the transformation process, the Galatians' journey was interrupted by those, Paul says, this is how he first describes them in chapter 1, just those who want to distort the gospel. They claimed you forgot one thing, the law. In addition to trusting Jesus, You need to obey a few key aspects of the law, chiefly circumcising any male converts. It was the sign of God's covenant with Abraham, after all. How could that be left behind? See, those who distort the gospel, they inverted the order of operations for the Galatian church. They said, believe, be transformed, or transform yourself through following certain aspects of the law, then you will be saved. As we come to chapter 4, it's as if the subway door is open. The Galatians have one foot on the platform, one foot on the train. They're about to turn back from the gospel of Jesus toward the false gospel of Jesus plus circumcision, Jesus plus human wisdom, Jesus plus political factions, Jesus plus my own efforts to self-transform. At that critical moment, Paul delivers a sobering message. Don't turn back, he says. Don't turn back. Look at verses 8 and 9 of our passage. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather, to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world whose slaves you want to become once more? In the text, Paul asks the question, how can you turn back? But it's clearly rhetorical. He already has the answer teed up in his mind. He's telling them, don't do it. Don't turn back. And so to ensure that the Galatians get the message, Paul answers two additional questions in the early verses of our passage. Who were the Galatians? And who are the Galatians? First, who were the Galatians? Look at verses 1 through 2 of our passage in a Bible or on your bulletin. I mean that an heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by his father. Paul uses an analogy from Roman law that a child could not inherit the father's estate until he reached a certain age. So if the father died early, the child was the heir, but until he was 14, he had a tutor over him. And then even after the age of 14, he had a manager or a steward over him until 25. Still, in our world, the date, the final thing they hold from you, renting a car without the extra insurance. See, the law, people knew even back then, something about our brains are not fully formed until 25. Before that moment, the child was no different than a slave. He was not free to go where he wanted to go. He was not free to he was not free to do what he wanted to do. He was not free to use or make money in the way he wanted to use or make money. Now, verse 3. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. Here, Paul makes the claim that the slavery was not simply the plight of Roman children waiting to inherit. It was the plight of the Galatians before the gospel. Who were the Galatians? Paul says, you were slaves. That's who you were. Now, for the force of Paul's claim to really hit in our day, we need to understand how slavery in the Roman world functioned, how it was quite different than the slavery in the English-speaking New World from 1619 till the adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1865. You see, in ancient Rome, slavery was not race-based. Anyone, in theory, could become a slave. Free people became slaves due to the outcome of wars or because they fell into debt. In addition, the children of mothers who were slaves were born into slavery, regardless of their race. See, the Galatians, differently than how we might imagine it, the Galatians lived with an acute awareness that free people can and do become slaves. It was not a fixed binary in their day. They lived with the fear that it could happen to them. When Paul says, we also, when we were children, were enslaved, he means that before the gospel, there was a war for your own freedom, and you could never win that war. He means that before the gospel, there was a moral debt you racked up that you could never repay. He means that before the gospel, you were born into a situation that you couldn't get out of without being born again. See, anyone could become a slave. And Paul says, that was you. You were slaves. But what exactly was enslaving them? Again, it's in verse 3. In the same way also, when we were children, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. This word, elementary principles, 2 words in our English translation, 1 word in Greek, it's layered with meaning. And different scholars argue for different particularities of the meaning. And oftentimes when scholars can't agree on the meaning of the word, the biblical author may just have all the layers of meaning in mind as he is writing. And so here are the 3 meanings for elementary principles. First, it meant the way the world works. Second, the way the world is made. Third, the unseen spiritual world. And if you're using a paper Bible, you'll see the ESV translation has a footnote. These elementary principles could also be rendered as the elementary spirits or elemental spirits of the world. That's that third definition of the word. So let me move through these, what they were enslaved to, these elementary principles. First, the way the world works. Paul says, you were enslaved by the reality that you had to do more to be more. You had to work more to get more, to live better to get better, to find security through strength. It's just the way the world works, and you were enslaved to those principles. Second, the way the world is made. The ancients believed that there were 4 basic elements: earth, air, fire, and water. The ancients were often enslaved to fear that these elements would eventually turn against them and destroy everything they had devoted their lives to building through an earthquake, a sandstorm, a windstorm, wildfire, or simply fire from a household cooking accident. They were enslaved to the fear of when and how this might happen. Third, the unseen spiritual world. Roman culture developed systems of gods associated with these 4 basic elements. Farmers were enslaved by the constant need to appease the gods of the earth. Sailors enslaved to appeasing the god of water. Shepherds enslaved as they sought to appease the god of fire, to spare their pastures from destruction. There was slavery to fear, and slavery to fear's counterpart in the ancient world, fatalism. They were afraid of what could happen, and the fatalism that there was nothing they could do to prevent it from happening. Now, lest we think that enslavement to these elementary principles of the world was somehow a problem for primitive pagans, but we in the enlightened 21st century, we've figured out how to overcome it. Just this week, New York Times opinion columnist Ezra Klein published an article and did a podcast about Americans' latest obsession, their health. He said this: on some level, what we all want is control. Control of our bodies, control of our health, control over never getting diseases that scare us all. On the other hand, a desire for endless control over your own body and future can be mentally poisonous too, because you can't control it. What are we enslaved to here as Americans? Control. The elementary principle, the false God that we control our own destiny. And even a secular columnist realizes that slavery is mentally poisonous because it's a false God. Slavery to the elementary principles is alive and well in our day. And so Paul says, don't turn back. You were slaves. Don't turn back. So who are the Galatians? Look at verses 4 and 5 with me. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. You were slaves, but in Christ, you are sons. This is even more radical of a transformation, precisely because Paul is not talking to men only. Remember, if you want to go to my son slide, that's next. Remember, back in 3:28, Paul said, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And then he says he doesn't say neither male nor female. He says no male and female, which is actually a direct quotation of Genesis chapter 2, when God makes the man and the woman. It's a direct quotation of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. What Paul is doing there is he's saying that in Christ, there is this whole new created order that's going on. The difference now can only be described in new creation language. And so, though he talks about men and women as equal inheritors, he still uses the language of sons so that they get the point, that the women now are included too. Because in Roman law, only sons could inherit an estate. Now in Christ, women share equally in the Father's inheritance. The language of sons would have been important to Paul's first readers, so they did not miss this point. One commentator used the helpful language of, in Christ there are sons, and there are daughter sons. You see this also, it cuts the other way. Some biblical metaphors that are primarily about women also include men. Just as the bride of Christ refers to both women and men, so here both men and women receive adoption as sons. There is no greater transformation. You were slaves. You are sons. And this gospel good news is even better when you dig a little deeper into the Greek word behind our English translation, adoption. In Paul's writing, adoption is probably the best English equivalent we have, but it's not quite precise. The literal translation of that word would be something like son placement. See, the English adoption connotes compassion for a homeless child. The Roman son placement functioned quite differently. It was practiced by wealthy householders when they did not have a male heir who could inherit their property. The wealthy man would seek out another man, usually an adult, another man of character, of status, a man that he considered worthy to take over his household. Biblical scholar Nijay Gupta puts it like this. He makes a great point. He says, a large number of Roman emperors were son-placed. For example, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. They were not adopted because they were poor, orphaned, or mistreated children. On the contrary, they were found to be worthy of entering a prestigious household through son placement, so to become emperor, the highest station in the land. So here's the payoff. Listen closely to this. God the Father already had an heir, his one and only Son, Jesus Christ. Colossians 1:15 describes Jesus Christ as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Jesus was the ultimate heir. Yet in elective love, God decided to son place all who trust the gospel of his Son and make them heirs of a kingdom greater and grander than Rome. If Paul had ever met Shakespeare, he might say something like, Rome and every empire before or since is but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard from no more. Rome, Paul would say, is the tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It is the kingdom Jesus proclaimed that signifies everything. The Father's Son places us not because we are worthy of entering his prestigious household, but because Jesus is worthy. Jesus is enough. Jesus' gospel, as Dale taught us last week, is unimprovable. Don't turn back. You were slaves, you are sons. Don't turn back. And the good news continues in verses 6 and 7. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, so that you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Verses 4 through 5 demonstrates that we are sons of the Father legally. Verses 6 through 7 demonstrate that we are sons of the Father experientially. What God makes legally binding, he makes experientially clear. We get to cry out, Abba, Father. There are three things to note about this prayer to God the Father. First, crying out is a translation of a Greek word that means loud, guttural, emotional sound. The experience we have of our adoption, our son placement, is deep. It's personal. It's cathartic. It's satisfying. And notice, we tend to skip this, but there are actually two words for father in this prayer. Abba is the informal and familial Aramaic word for father. And then what you read, Abba, Father, Paul is just using the standard Greek word pater, from which we get our Spanish word padre, little fun fact there, or papa in English. Pater just means father. So he is using two different languages to talk about the same thing. The two words and the two languages reflect the two cultures of the Galatian churches. Paul is masterfully showing the Aramaic-speaking, circumcised Jewish believers that they have been adopted as sons and daughter-sons right alongside the Greek-speaking, uncircumcised Gentile believers. It's a picture, a beautiful picture of God's intention for the unity of the church in two words: Abba, Father, Abba, Pater. Third, most importantly, Abba was the word Jesus himself used to address God in prayer. Mark chapter 14, verse 35. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not as I will, but what you will. At his moment of greatest need, deepest anguish, and highest uncertainty, Mark tells us that what Jesus called God: Abba, Dad, Daddy, Papa. Some even think it's used by even babies, Dada. In Galatians 4:6, Paul tells us that what Jesus called God, we now get to call God. In our moments of greatest need, deepest anguish, and highest uncertainty, we are not only legally son-placed, we are offered the chance to let it fly, to cry out, Dad, I need you. Don't turn back. You were slaves. You are sons. Don't turn back. To lock in this message in the next set of verses, Paul repeats the same truth, reminding the Galatians who they were and who they are. Verses 8 and 9. Formerly, when you did not know God, you were enslaved to those that by nature are not God's. But now that you have come to know God, or rather be known by God, how can you turn back? Don't turn back. I love that Paul delivers it in the form of a question. It's a good question for all of us to consider as we think about applying Galatians 4 to our lives. How are you turning back? When you are criticized and want so badly to respond defensively, how can you turn back from sonship to slavery of other people's opinions of you? When you're wronged and want so badly to hold a grudge, get even, or let the person know how you really feel, how can you turn back from sonship to slavery to anger and unforgiveness? When it comes to what you do with your body, how can you turn back from slavery to from sonship to slavery to fleeting experiences of pleasure? When you have the chance to give generously, how can you turn back from sonship to slavery to self-security and control? When you have conflict with your spouse, how can you turn back from sonship to slavery to the need to be right? When you struggle as a parent, how can you turn back from sonship to slavery to control what is not always in your control? When it comes to politics, how can you turn back from sonship that comes from trusting Jesus to the slavery that comes from trusting fallible human leaders? I'll tell you about my slavery a bit. My own slavery, it has to do with the church. Sometimes I turn back from sonship, knowing that Jesus Christ is the true pastor, to slavery to fear that somehow I could mess this beautiful thing called the Williamsburg Community Chapel up. And sometimes that keeps me up at night. And that's a slavery to fear. And Galatians 4 asks the question, how are you turning back? And then it reminds us, don't turn back. So again, so I can avoid criticism and messing up the chapel, I'll tell you how the story ended. The subway doors open, and I, of course, decide I've got to help Nina out. I'm going to risk the train. I turn back. The problem is, I know I can't get all the way to the Plaza Hotel. And so I'm going, how do I stash the tickets somewhere where she can get them? To whom should I give the tickets? And as I get out of the subway, I see the reggae Rasta man. They're playing on the platform. I go, sir, excuse me, but the guy in the Mets hat, which by the way, that I love, just went right as I was considering giving him the tickets, he went and hugged him. I thought, I'm not sure that guy's he looks a little entranced by the music. I'm gonna keep going. And so I go back up to Columbus Circle, back to the bagel shop, where we got the bagels. And I run into the bagel store, and I talk to the woman at the cash register. I said, my wife, I'm gonna call her. She has no idea, but I'm handing these tickets. When she gets here, she has blonde hair. Okay, bye. And I run back, and I try to jump on the subway again at Columbus Circle. I'm trying to go to Penn Station, but instead of the blue train, I accidentally got on the orange train. I pop out at Herald Square. I'm in the middle of the island. I need to be on the western side of the island, and I just start hoofing it. And when I prep for a sermon, there are a few books involved. I have this backpack filled with books. I'm sweating. I made the train, and hopefully you liked the sermon a couple weeks ago. See, I did turn back, but there wasn't enough on the line for me to put Nina in the difficult position of having to retrieve the car and the bags without a ticket. But in Galatians 4, Paul reminds us just how much is on the line. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. In the same way also, when we were children, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. Don't turn back. You were a slave. In Christ, you are a son. Don't turn back.
Thanks for joining us today. Here at the chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. And we hope you'll join us as we walk the Exodus way and learn to trust God on the way out of Egypt, the way between in the wilderness, and the way into his presence.